Hi, this is Kirsten Snyder. I'm an Arabic and anthropology major with a minor in political science. I chose the Yemeni conflict because it obviously has to do with the Arabic major, as Yemen is an Arabic country, and I also didn't really know a whole lot about the conflict, so this was a way to educate myself on it. So we'll start out with some general background information on the conflict. It starts with the revolution in 2011-2012 during the Arab Spring. The goal of the revolution was to overthrow the president Saleh, which they ended up accomplishing in 2012. After Saleh is overthrown, Abdrabbu Mansour Hadi, Saleh's vice president, becomes the new leader. This is a picture of Hadi. From now on, I'll be referring to him as Hadi just because it's a little bit easier to pronounce for me. At the time Hadi becomes president, the country split into factions. These factions are the Houthi rebellion, the Hadi government, and the Southern Transitional Council, or also known as STC. He's unable to unify these factions in the country and fend off al-Qaeda and the Houthi militants. Houthis cause Hadi to resign after attacking his palace and residence, and after this the Houthis declare themselves in charge. They dissolve the parliament and put in place an interim revolutionary committee. At this point, Hadi declares himself legitimate leader and flees to Saudi Arabia, and the civil war begins. Next, we'll talk about the main actors in the crisis and what they've contributed to it. These actors are the Hadi government, the Houthi rebellion, and a Saudi-led coalition. The Hadi government is seen by most as the legitimate government in Yemen. So it's run out of Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, which is where Hadi fled after he left Yemen. And in an official statement by Hadi, he said the Yemeni government is striving to restore peace, security, and stability and provide essential services to its people, while the country remains gripped by a war imposed by Iran and Hezbollah-backed armed militias. In this statement, President Hadi also highlighted his government's efforts to protect civilians, especially women and children, and said that it's instructed the country's military not to recruit children, as well as to rehabilitate those that have been detained while in the ranks of the rebels. So this actually refers to some of the issues that the UN looks at during its investigation into human rights violations in Yemen. The Houthi rebellion, or officially called Ansar Allah, which is the supporters or helpers of God, is an Islamic religious political armed movement that emerged from northern Yemen in the 1990s. They're a Shiite Islamic group, and they're seen as Iranian proxy by mostly Saudi Arabia, who are involved in both Arab League, Arab League, Saudi Arabian-led coalition, and the GCC. And they were initially part of they were supported by Saleh, and they were initially part of the revolution against him, but he paved the way for them to easily take over important cities without opposition so that they could wipe out his enemies for him. And they're also labeled as a terrorist group by the UN, the US, and many other countries. Finally, the Saudi-led coalition. They are supporters of Hadi and the Hadi government, and it includes all the nations of the Gulf Cooperation Council, or the GCC, except for Oman, and they also include some nations from the Arab League. They began a bombing campaign and mobilization of various armed forces in the region after Hadi fled to Riyadh, and they criticized the coup and rejected the Houthis' authority. In an official statement by the coalition, they said, "Our nations have decided to respond to the request of President Hadi of the Republic of Yemen to protect Yemen and its dear people from Houthi militias' aggression, which was and is still a tool in the hands of foreign powers that did not stop tampering with the security and stability of brotherly Yemen." In this statement, they seem to be pointing towards Iran as the foreign powers that are tampering with Yemen. It seems that, to me at least, that Saudi Arabia has very much a thing against Iran. On top of these three actors, al-Qaeda has also been involved in the crisis. Over the past couple of years, extremist groups have sustained and adapted their presences in Yemen, and the coalition has cut secret deals with al-Qaeda fighters, paying some to leave key cities and towns and letting others retreat with weapons, equipment, and wads of looted cash. Hundreds more were even recruited to go join the coalition itself. Living conditions in Yemen are grim. At least 6,660 civilians have been killed and 10,563 injured in the fighting. 1,000 more civilians have died from preventable causes, including malnutrition, disease, and poor health. This um, because of the famine and drought and many more other things. 22 million people are in need of humanitarian aid, and the world's largest food security emergency is going on right now. 7.3 million are on the brink of famine as a direct result of behavior of parties to the conflict, including indiscriminate attacks, attacks against civilians and protected objects, sieges, blockades, and restrictions on movement. And also, there's a cholera outbreak that has affected 1.1 million people. Next is the UN investigation. They found that there has been violations by all parties. There's been attacks on residential areas in which thousands have died, arbitrary detentions, torture, and forced disappearances and recruiting of children. They found that coalition airstrikes have caused most direct civilian casualties and that they have hit residential areas, markets, funerals, weddings, detention facilities, civilian boats, and medical facilities. These could have been avoided easily if they had just not been careless with where they were targeting these airstrikes. And they've also found that about half of the civilian casualties, 3,233 of the civilians that were killed, were reportedly killed by coalition forces. And they also have reasonable grounds to believe that individuals in the government of Yemen and the coalition may have conducted attacks in violation of the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution that may amount to war crimes. The UN has also expressed concern at the situation in the southern city of Taiz. The report says civilians, including women and children, have been hit by shelling and snipers from the Houthis and other parties while in their homes, fetching water at local wells, or on their way to purchase food or seek medical attention. The Houthis are accused of indiscriminately using weapons with wide area effect in Taiz and other urban settings, which would constitute a war crime. Victims and witnesses also describe persistent and pervasive aggressive behavior, including sexual violence perpetrated by pro-government forces, and all parties have conscripted or enlisted children, some as young as 8 years old, and used them to participate actively in the war. The coalition has responded to the UN's investigation negatively, not surprisingly. They've interfered with it from the beginning. They say that there's been false allegations made against them, and it's based on misleading reports by some non-governmental organizations, specifically that it had targeted civilians, restricted humanitarian aid, and carried out arbitrary detentions. They also expressed their surprise for the report's disregard of the great humanitarian role played by the coalition states in Yemen and the huge humanitarian assistance it has provided in order to alleviate the suffering of the Yemeni people. So, some possible solutions for the conflict, or at least to lessen the suffering of the people. The UN has urged the international community to refrain from providing arms that could be used in the conflict. It seems to be a reference to Western countries who are selling weapons to coalition and to Iran, which the coalition alleges is smuggling weapons to the Houthis. The US has itself sold billions of dollars worth of arms to Saudi Arabia, who is in the coalition. And the actors in this crisis are already well armed. To give them more weapons will only cause the Yemeni people more pain and suffering. The parties involved must take responsibility for their actions also, as we saw with the response by the coalition to the investigation. They only want to focus on the humanitarian aid that they provided and not the harm that they have caused. Lastly, I have my citations for the research that I did for this project.